A woman finds two abandoned twins on Christmas Eve, and what they tell her leaves her in shock. Snow fell softly on Willow Creek that Christmas Eve, transforming the small town into a picturesque winter wonderland. Colorful lights twinkled on the storefronts lining Main Street. Wreaths adorned the doors of cozy homes, and the grand fir tree in the town square stood majestically against the darkening twilight sky. Margaret Thompson adjusted her red scarf as she strolled along the snow-dusted sidewalk. At 65, after 3 decades dedicated to teaching at the local elementary school, she now faced her days with a blend of peace and loneliness that only retirement could bring. Her footsteps echoed in the quiet of the nearly deserted town. Most families were already home, gathered around their dinner tables, sharing stories and laughter. Margaret could glimpse scenes through the illuminated windows, children playing, adults conversing, the occasional glint of wine glasses raised in a toast. "Another Christmas," she murmured to herself, her voice lost in the chilly breeze. In her purse, a small gift wrapped in gold paper felt heavy, a habit she couldn't break, buying a present in the hope of having someone to give it to. This year, it was a collection of short stories, chosen with her usual care, destined to sit on her bookshelf alongside the other undelivered gifts from previous years. As she passed the frozen fountain in the center of the square, something caught her attention. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, a muffled sob. Margaret stopped, tilting her head to listen more closely. There it was again. Her eyes scanned the area until they landed on a bench partially covered in snow. 2 small figures huddled together, shivering visibly in the early evening chill. Margaret approached cautiously. They were 2 boys, identical down to the last strand of their sandy blonde hair. They couldn't have been older than 10. Their faces were flushed with cold, and their blue eyes widened as they noticed her approach. "Hello," she said softly, her teacher's heart immediately aching at the sight of children alone on a night like this. "Are you all right? Where are your parents?" The boys exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. The one on the left, with a small scratch above his eyebrow, spoke first. We don't have parents," he whispered, his voice trembling, not just from the cold. Margaret felt as if the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "You're alone? On this night?" The other boy nodded slowly, pulling something from inside his worn coat, a creased photograph. "So we only have this," he said, extending the picture. With trembling fingers, Margaret took the photo. As she looked at it, her eyes widened, and she let out an audible gasp. The image showed a young woman, smiling, with the same blue eyes as the boys. But what truly shocked her was recognizing the location where the photo had been taken. It was the staircase of the old Willow Creek Library, long since closed. "What are your names?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm Alex," said the boy with the scratch, "and this is my brother, Ethan." "Alex and Ethan," Margaret repeated softly. "You must be freezing. Would you like to come with me? I have hot chocolate at home and we can warm up while we talk." The twins exchanged another look, years of silent communication evident in their interaction. "You won't call the police?" Ethan asked, fear evident in his voice. Margaret hesitated. As a retired teacher, she knew the correct procedure was precisely that, to call the authorities. But something in the boys' gaze, the way they clung to each other, gave her pause. "No," she finally answered. "Not without understanding what's going on first, I promise." Slowly, the boys rose, their small hands still intertwined. Alex stepped forward, assuming a protective stance towards his brother. "Can we trust you?" he asked, his blue eyes piercing in a way no 10-year-olds should. Margaret felt her heart clench. "Yes," she replied simply. "You can." As she led the twins through the snow towards her home, Margaret couldn't help but think that this Christmas would be different from all the others. The gift in her purse wouldn't go unclaimed after all. And perhaps, just perhaps, fate had other plans for her solitary life. Little did she know that the secrets these boys carried would unearth long-buried stories, not just from her own life, but from the entire town of Willow Creek. Christmas Eve was just beginning, and with it, a journey that would change everything. The snow continued to fall softly, covering their tracks as they walked, as if the universe itself was trying to protect the beginning of this unlikely story. A retired teacher and two mysterious twins, united by fate on a Christmas Eve, none of them would ever forget. Margaret's house was a small Victorian cottage on Elm Street, with a porch wrapped in Christmas lights and a modestly decorated tree visible through the front window. As they entered, the welcoming warmth enveloped them like a hug. "First, let's get warm," Margaret said, guiding the boys to the living room. She lit the fireplace, which soon crackled merrily, and fetched soft blankets from the chest near the sofa. "I'll make us some hot chocolate." In the kitchen, as she warmed the milk and prepared the mugs, Margaret could hear the twins' whispers in the living room. There was something in their voices, a forced maturity that tugged at her retired teacher's heart. She returned with a tray holding 3 steaming mugs and a plate of gingerbread cookies she had baked earlier. Alex and Ethan accepted the drinks with trembling hands, their eyes lighting up at the first sip. "This is delicious," Ethan murmured, a small smile gracing his face for the first time. "Thank you, ma'am," Alex added, ever the more formal of the two. Margaret settled into her favorite armchair, observing the boys for a moment before speaking. "Now, how about you tell me a little about yourselves?" The twins exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Alex took a deep breath and began. "Our parents died 2 years ago in a car accident," he said, his voice low but steady. "Since then, we've been in different foster homes." Ethan flinched slightly at the word homes, and Margaret didn't miss it. "The last place," Ethan began hesitantly. "They weren't bad like some of the others, but they didn't really care," Alex finished. "It was like we were invisible, like we were just numbers on a check." Margaret's heart ached. In her years as a teacher, she had seen similar cases, children treated as obligations rather than human beings in need of love and attention. "So you ran away," she concluded softly. The boys nodded. "It was 3 days ago," Alex explained. "We took a bus here because—" He paused, glancing at Ethan again. "Because," Margaret encouraged gently. "Because we found this among our mom's things," Ethan said, pulling out the creased photo again. She wrote something on the back. Margaret turned the photograph over. On the back, in delicate handwriting, it read, "Willow Creek, where my heart found peace. Perhaps one day, when they need it, my boys will also find their way home." "Our mom grew up here," Alex explained. She always talked about Willow Creek as a special place, a safe place. Memories began to surface in Margaret's mind. A golden-haired young woman who used to frequent the library where she volunteered during the summers, always with a book under her arm and a gentle smile on her face. "What was your mother's name?" she asked, although she already suspected the answer. "Mary," Ethan replied. "Mary Evans." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, remembering young Mary, so full of dreams and promise. "I knew your mother," she said softly. "She spent hours in the library where I worked." The twins' eyes widened at this revelation. "You knew our mum?" Alex asked, leaning forward with interest. "Yes," Margaret smiled at the memory. "She was a special young woman, always kind, always dreaming of great adventures." Tears began to well up in Ethan's eyes. "We miss her so much," he whispered. Alex put his arm around his brother's shoulders, comforting him silently. "And now," Margaret asked gently, "what do you plan to do?" "We can't go back," Alex said firmly. "They'll separate us. They've tried before, saying it would be easier to find families for us individually." "We don't want to be separated," Ethan added, his voice trembling. "We're all we have left." Margaret looked at the 2 boys before her, so young, and yet carrying so much weight on their small shoulders. Her mind told her she should call the authorities immediately, but her heart— "It's getting late," she finally said. "Why don't you stay here tonight? It's Christmas Eve, after all. Tomorrow, we can think more clearly about what to do." The relief on the twins' faces was palpable. "You won't turn us in?" Alex asked, hope mixed with caution in his voice. "Not tonight," Margaret answered honestly. "Tonight we'll just focus on keeping you safe and warm." As she prepared the guest room for the boys, Margaret knew she was possibly getting involved in something much bigger than she imagined. But hearing the twins' soft voices talking in the hallway, seeing the way they cared for each other, she felt she couldn't do anything differently. That night, as the snow continued to fall outside, 3 lonely hearts found a moment of peace under the same roof. And perhaps, just perhaps, the spirit of Christmas had more surprises in store for them all. Christmas morning dawned with an almost reverent silence in Willow Creek. The snow that had fallen overnight covered everything in a pristine white blanket, and the first rays of sun made the landscape sparkle as if studded with diamonds. Margaret awoke early, as was her custom. For a moment, she lay in bed, listening to the soft sounds of the house. Then she remembered she wasn't alone this Christmas. In the guest room, 2 small hearts beat, bringing life to a home that had long known only solitude. Getting up, she put on her robe and walked quietly down the hallway. She stopped at the guest room door, slightly ajar, and peeked inside. Alex and Ethan slept soundly, curled up together like puppies. The sight made her heart clench in a way she hadn't felt in years. In the kitchen, as she prepared breakfast, Margaret found herself immersed in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. What should she do? The logical answer, the correct answer, according to all norms, would be to call the authorities immediately. After all, she had 2 unaccompanied minors in her house. But something held her back. Perhaps it was the fear in the boys' eyes when they talked about being separated, or the way they clung to each other, as if the whole world were against them. Or perhaps... Her eyes fell on a framed photograph on the kitchen shelf. A golden-haired boy smiled at the camera, his green eyes shining with joy. Andrew. Her son. Memories flooded her mind like a wave. Andrew was only 12 when illness took him, so young, so full of life and promise. Christmas had always been his favorite time of year. A solitary tear rolled down Margaret's cheek. She quickly wiped it away as she heard soft footsteps coming from the hallway. "Mrs. Thompson?" Alex's voice was hesitant. She turned, forcing a smile. "Good morning, dear. Did you sleep well?" Alex nodded, Ethan appearing right behind him. Both seemed uncertain, as if they didn't quite know what to do or say. At that moment, looking at the twins, something solidified in Margaret's heart. They needed her, and perhaps she needed them too. She needed... "Boys," she said, her voice firmer now. "How about we make a special breakfast? It's Christmas after all." The twins' faces lit up, a mixture of surprise and joy. "Can we help?" Ethan asked shyly. "Of course you can," Margaret smiled, feeling a wave of affection for the boys. "Let's see what we have in the fridge." The next few hours were filled with an activity that Margaret's house hadn't seen in years. The aroma of pancakes and bacon filled the air, mingling with the sound of children's laughter. Alex and Ethan took turns helping, their small hands eager to learn and contribute. As they ate, Margaret observed the twins. There was a lightness about them now, a sparkle in their eyes that hadn't been there the night before. She found herself wondering what it would be like to have them around every day, filling the house with life and joy again. After breakfast, to the boys' surprise, Margaret announced that she had presents for them. "Presents?" Ethan asked, his eyes widening. "But how?" Margaret smiled, she was a little embarrassed. "Well, I have a habit of buying presents every year, even without having anyone to give them to. I guess this year, fate had other plans." She handed each of the boys a package wrapped in gold paper. Carefully, almost reverently, they opened their gifts. For Alex, an adventure novel. For Ethan, a set of colored pencils and a sketchbook. "Thank you," Alex whispered, his eyes shining with unshed tears. Ethan, in turn, impulsively hugged Margaret. She stiffened for a moment, surprised, before relaxing and returning the hug. As the day progressed, Margaret found herself sharing stories of Christmases past. She talked about her family traditions, about the gifts she used to give and receive, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to talk about Andrew. "He loved Christmas," she said softly, holding the porcelain angel her son had made in school. "He was always the first one awake, dragging everyone out of bed to open presents." Alex and Ethan listened attentively, their eyes filled with empathy. "We're so sorry about your son, Mrs. Thompson," Alex said, placing his small hand on hers. Margaret felt her heart warm at the gesture. "Thank you, dear," she replied, surprised by the boy's maturity. As evening approached, the reality of the situation began to weigh on Margaret again. She knew she needed to make a decision. Sitting with the boys in the living room, lit only by the Christmas tree lights, she took a deep breath. "Alex, Ethan, we need to talk about what will happen next." The twins exchanged apprehensive glances. "Are you going to send us back?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. Margaret shook her head. "No, not today. Actually, I was thinking, maybe you could stay here for a few more days, until we figure out the best way to help you." The relief on the boys' faces was palpable. "Really?" Alex asked, hope evident in his voice. "Yes," Margaret confirmed. "But we'll have to be careful, and eventually we'll have to find a permanent legal solution to your situation." The twins nodded solemnly, understanding the seriousness of the situation. That night, as she tucked the boys into bed, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. She knew the road ahead would be difficult and complicated, but for the first time in a long time, she had a purpose, a reason to fight. Looking at the sleeping faces of Alex and Ethan, Margaret made a silent promise. She would do everything in her power to protect these boys and ensure they had the love and security they deserved. The future was uncertain, but at that moment, on that Christmas night, there was hope. And for Margaret, Alex, and Ethan, that was more than enough. The days following Christmas passed in a blur of activity and laughter in Margaret's house. Alex and Ethan seemed to flourish under her care, their unique personalities emerging more and more. However, beneath the newfound joy, Margaret felt the constant weight of uncertainty about the boys' future. It was on a cold January morning that she finally decided she needed help. With the twins occupied with a puzzle in the living room, Margaret retreated to the kitchen and picked up the phone, dialing a number she knew by heart. "Hello?" The familiar voice of Susan sounded from the other end of the line. "Susan, it's Margaret. I need your help. It's complicated." Half an hour later, Susan Miller, a retired social worker and Margaret's best friend for decades, sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea between her hands. Her astute eyes studied Margaret over her glasses as she finished recounting the story of the twins. "Oh, Margaret," Susan sighed, placing her cup on the table. "You understand what kind of situation you've gotten yourself into, don't you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "I know it's not conventional, but Susan, you should see these boys. They're so scared of being separated, of going back to a system that has failed them repeatedly." Susan reached out, covering Margaret's hand with her own. "I understand, dear. Believe me, in all my years as a social worker, I've seen many heartbreaking cases. But I also know the legal risks of harboring minors without proper authorization." "What should I do then?" Margaret asked, her voice laden with worry. "Hand them back to a system that mistreated them?" Susan was silent for a moment, thoughtful. "Not necessarily, but we need to approach this the right way, legally." She paused, as if considering something. "You know, maybe we should talk to Edward. Edward Carter, the lawyer." Susan nodded. "He has experience in adoption and custody cases, and if I'm not mistaken, you two were classmates in college, weren't you?" Margaret felt a pang of nostalgia. "Yes, many years ago. I haven't seen him since Andrew's funeral. He can give us a legal perspective on the situation. And Margaret," Susan added, her tone softening, "I know you've become attached to these boys, but we need to think about what's best for them in the long run." Margaret nodded, knowing her friend was right. "I'll call him." 2 hours later, Edward Carter sat in Margaret's living room, his impeccable suit contrasting with the cozy surroundings. Alex and Ethan had been kindly asked to play in their room, although Margaret could sense their curiosity and apprehension. "Well, Margaret," Edward began, adjusting his glasses, "I must say you've certainly put yourself in an interesting situation." "I know, Edward, but what can I do? I can't just abandon them." The lawyer nodded understandingly. "I understand your dilemma. Legally, the situation is delicate. Harboring runaway minors, even with the best intentions, can result in serious charges." Susan, who was sitting next to Margaret, intervened. "But surely there's something we can do. Some way to ensure the boys stay together and safe. Edward reflected for a moment. Well, we could start by investigating their history in the system. If we can document cases of neglect or abuse, that would give us grounds to argue for alternative placement. How would we do that? Margaret asked, leaning forward with interest. Susan, Edward turned to the former social worker. Do you still have contacts in the Department of Social Services? Susan nodded. A few. I can make some discreet calls. See what I can find out about the boys' history in the system. Excellent, Edward continued. Meanwhile, I can research legal precedents, see if there are any similar cases that might help us. Margaret, you said the boys mentioned previous attempts to separate them. Yes, Margaret confirmed. Johnny said they've already tried placing them in separate families, claiming it would be easier to find homes for them individually. Edward frowned. That's concerning. Generally, there's a strong preference for keeping siblings together, especially in cases of trauma like theirs. The fact that they tried to separate them suggests there might be more to this story than we're seeing. The three fell silent for a moment, the weight of the situation hanging over them. It was Susan who finally spoke. So, what's our next step? Edward stood up, walking over to the window. We need to proceed cautiously. Margaret, for now, keep the boys here. It's risky, but moving them now could complicate things further. Susan, start your discreet inquiries. I'll research our legal options and see if I can get any information on the boys' biological parents. There might be relatives who weren't properly considered for custody. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. What about the boys? What should I tell them? For now, just reassure them that they're safe, Susan advised. Don't make promises you're not sure you can keep, but make it clear that you're doing everything you can to help them. When Edward and Susan left, Margaret went upstairs to check on Alex and Ethan. She found them sitting on the bed looking anxiously at the door. Is everything okay? Alex asked, his voice small and worried. Margaret smiled, sitting down between them. Yes, dears, I have some friends who are going to help us sort all this out. We won't have to leave, Ethan asked, his eyes wide and hopeful. Not for now, Margaret replied, pulling them close. We're working on finding the best solution for both of you. As she hugged the twins, Margaret felt a determination grow within her. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was full of uncertainties. But looking at Alex and Ethan, she knew she would do everything in her power to protect them and give them the loving home they deserved. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Margaret felt she was on the right path. With Susan and Edward's help, she would face the challenges that lay ahead, one day at a time, always with the boys' best interests at heart. Sunday afternoon arrived with an unusual calmness in Willow Creek. Margaret sat on her porch, watching Alex and Ethan play in the snow-covered yard. The boys chased each other, their laughter echoing through the quiet neighborhood. The scene brought a smile to the elderly woman's lips, but also a pang of pain to her heart. As she watched them, Margaret felt the weight of her memories intensify. There was something about the twins, in their innocence and joy, that touched a deep, long-dormant part of her soul. She sighed, knowing it was time to confront the past she had kept buried for so long. Boys, she called softly. Come here for a moment, please. Alex and Ethan stopped their play and approached the porch, looking at Margaret with curiosity. Yes, Mrs. Thompson? Alex asked, always the first to speak. Margaret smiled gently. Come, sit with me. There's something I want to share with you. The twins exchanged intrigued glances before climbing the porch steps and sitting on the wooden benches beside Margaret. The old woman was silent for a moment, gathering the courage for the words that were about to come out. You two remind me so much of someone I knew a long time ago, she began, her voice soft and laden with emotion. Someone very special to me. Ethan tilted his head, curious. Who, Mrs. Thompson? Margaret took a deep breath, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. My son, Andrew. He would be about your age now. The twins fell silent, sensing the change in the conversation's tone. Alex, always the more empathetic, reached out and gently touched Margaret's arm. What happened to him, Mrs. Thompson? He asked softly. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the memories flow. When she opened them again, there was a deep sadness in them. "It was many years ago, boys. Andrew was only 12. We were coming back from a trip to the lake. It was a beautiful summer day, and Andrew was so happy." Her voice faltered for a moment. "A truck lost control on the road. It happened so fast. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me Andrew hadn't survived the accident." Tears now flowed freely down Margaret's wrinkled face. Alex and Ethan, moved by a compassion beyond their years, moved closer to her, each holding one of her hands. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Thompson," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly. Margaret squeezed the boys' hands, feeling a wave of affection for them. "Thank you, dears. You know, that's why I moved to this house. I needed a fresh start, away from the memories. But then you two showed up, and suddenly, I felt like a part of Andrew had come back to me." The twins exchanged glances, a silent understanding passing between them. Finally, Alex spoke. We lost someone too, Mrs. Thompson." Margaret looked at them, surprised. "You lost someone?" Ethan nodded, his voice low. "Our parents. It was 2 years ago. We were coming back from a trip to the park when the accident happened." The revelation hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. Suddenly, everything made sense. The sadness she sometimes saw in the boys' eyes, their maturity beyond their years, the way they had clung to her so quickly. "Oh, my dears," she whispered, pulling them into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry. It must have been so hard for you." Alex and Ethan snuggled into Margaret's embrace, letting down the barriers they had built since their parents' death. For several minutes, they stayed like that, united in their shared grief. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret saw something new in the boys' eyes: trust, understanding, and a bond that went beyond words. "You know," she began softly, "sometimes I think Andrew sent you two to me, to heal my heart and maybe so I could help heal yours too." Alex smiled through his tears. "I think our parents might have had the same idea, Mrs. Thompson," Ethan agreed. "How they always said angels appear when we need them most." Margaret felt her heart swell with love for these two brave boys. "Well, then let's honor Andrew and your parents by living our lives with joy and love. What do you say?" The twins nodded enthusiastically, and Margaret felt a surge of hope she hadn't experienced in decades. In the days that followed, a subtle but profound shift occurred in the dynamic between Margaret and the twins. The invisible barrier that had existed between them, built by unshared secrets and unexpressed pain, had dissolved. Alex and Ethan began to open up more, sharing stories about their parents, their mother's smile, their father's terrible jokes, the lazy Sundays they spent together watching movies. Margaret listened attentively, her heart filling with love for this family she had never met, but who had raised two such wonderful boys. In turn, Margaret shared more about Andrew, his mischievous antics, his love for adventure books, the sparkle in his eyes when he learned something new. The twins drank in every word, forming in their minds an image of the boy who could have been their friend. One evening, as Margaret tucked the boys into bed, Alex asked a question that had been bothering him for some time. "Mrs. Thompson," he began hesitantly, "do you think Andrew would be sad that you're taking care of us?" Margaret stopped what she was doing, surprised by the question. She looked at Alex, seeing the worry in his eyes. "Oh, Alex," she said softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I'm sure Andrew would be happy. He was always a generous boy, always wanting to share what he had. I think he'd love to know that I'm sharing the love I have for him with you two." Ethan, who had been listening intently, added, "Like our parents, they always said love grows when it's shared." Margaret smiled, touched by the wisdom of the boys' parents. "Your parents were very wise people, and they're right. The love I have for Andrew doesn't diminish the love I feel for you. In fact, I think it helps me love you even more." The twins smiled, an invisible weight being lifted from their shoulders. Margaret hugged them once more before turning off the lights. As she closed the bedroom door, Margaret reflected on how unpredictable life could be. She never imagined that, after so long living alone with her grief, she would find comfort and joy in two boys she had barely known for a few weeks. That night, Margaret slept with a light heart, feeling that she had finally found a purpose again. And although the pain of loss would never completely disappear, she knew she had found a new reason to move forward. In Alex and Ethan, she saw not only echoes of her lost son, but also the promise of a future filled with love and joy. Edward's office was immersed in a tense silence when Susan entered, carrying a thick folder. Margaret was already there, sitting in a leather armchair, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Edward, in turn, stood by the window, his gaze lost in the cityscape of Willow Creek. "I have news," Susan announced, her voice breaking the silence. Both Margaret and Edward turned to her, expectation evident on their faces. Susan opened the folder on Edward's desk. "After weeks of searching, I finally found something about the twins' family. They have an aunt." Margaret leaned forward, her eyes widening. "An aunt? But the boys never mentioned." "Probably because they don't know about her," Susan explained. "Her name is Claire Evans. She's the sister of the twins' mother, and from what I could gather, she's been looking for them for years." Edward frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Years? How is that possible? Why didn't she find them before?" Susan sighed, leafing through some documents. "That's where things get complicated. It seems there was some kind of legal dispute after the boys' parents died. Claire wanted custody, but for some reason, it was denied. The boys were placed in the foster care system and, well, somehow they disappeared from the records." Margaret felt a tightness in her chest. Disappeared? How do two children simply vanish from the system? Edward, who had been investigating on his own, approached the table. "I think I can explain that," he said, his voice grave. "My contacts informed me about some irregularities in the local foster care system. It seems there are people in positions of power manipulating the records." A heavy silence fell over the room as they all absorbed the information. Margaret was the first to break it. "And now? What do we do with this information?" Susan, who had been examining more documents, let out a surprised exclamation. "My goodness, you won't believe this." "What is it?" Margaret and Edward asked in unison. "Claire Evans," Susan said, looking at them with astonishment. "She lives here in Willow Creek. She's been living here for the past 2 years. The revelation landed like a bomb in the office." Margaret brought her hand to her mouth, shocked. "Here, all this time?" Edward began pacing the room, his mind working rapidly. "This changes everything. If she's here, we can contact her directly. Maybe she has more information about what really happened to the boys' family." Margaret, however, seemed hesitant. "But what about the twins? How are we going to tell them? They've already been through so much." Susan placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "You've been doing an amazing job helping them deal with their trauma, Margaret. Maybe it's time to give them a chance to reconnect with their family." Margaret nodded slowly, knowing Susan was right, but feeling a pang in her heart at the thought of possibly separating from the boys. That evening, back at home, Margaret watched Alex and Ethan playing in the yard. Their laughter echoed through the property, a sound that had become so precious to her in recent months. Gathering her courage, she called them, "Alex, Ethan, come here for a moment, please." The twins stopped their play and ran to her, their faces flushed from activity and bright smiles on their lips. "What is it, Mrs. Thompson?" Ethan asked, always the more curious of the two. Margaret took a deep breath. "Boys, we need to talk about something important. Something about your family." The twins' smiles faltered, a shadow passing over their eyes. Alex stepped forward, instinctively protective. "Our family, but they're gone." Margaret felt her heart clench at the pain in their voices. "I know, dears, but we discovered something today, something that could change a lot of things." She led them inside, sitting down with them on the living room sofa. Carefully and gently, she explained about Claire, their aunt they had never met, and how she had been looking for them all these years. The twins listened in silence, their expressions a mixture of confusion, fear, and a spark of hope. When Margaret finished, it was Ethan who spoke first. She really wants us." The vulnerability in his voice almost broke Margaret's heart. "Yes, dear, she's been looking for you for a long time." Alex, always the more skeptical, frowned. "But why didn't she find us before? Why did we end up in those foster homes if we had family?" Margaret sighed. "It's complicated, Alex. It seems there were some legal problems, but we're working to understand exactly what happened." The twins exchanged glances, having one of those silent conversations that only they understood. Finally, Ethan turned to Margaret, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "And you, Mrs. Thompson, what will happen to you?" The question hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. She pulled them both into a tight hug, feeling her own tears begin to fall. "Oh, my dears," she whispered, "no matter what happens, I will always be a part of your lives. Always." In the days that followed, Margaret worked tirelessly to help the twins process this new information. She encouraged them to express their fears and hopes, using techniques she had learned over the years to help children cope with trauma. One evening, as they colored together at the kitchen table, an activity that had become a comforting ritual for the three of them, Alex looked at Margaret with serious eyes. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, his voice low, What if our aunt doesn't like us?" Margaret put her colored pencil aside, giving the boy her full attention. "Oh, Alex, I'm sure she'll love you." "How could she not?" Ethan, who had been listening, added, "But what if she wants to separate us?" "That won't happen," Margaret stated firmly. "Edward and Susan are working to ensure you two stay together, no matter what." The boys seemed somewhat reassured by these words, but Margaret could see there were still unexpressed worries in their eyes. "You know," she said, taking their small hands in hers, "it's normal to be afraid of the unknown. But remember, you are strong, brave, and you have each other. And now, you have me too. No matter what happens, we'll face it together." The twins smiled shyly, squeezing Margaret's hands. As she tucked them into bed that night, Margaret couldn't help but think about Claire Evans, living so close, unaware that the nephews she had been searching for so long were just a few streets away. Fate, she thought, had a peculiar sense of humor. Looking at the sleeping faces of Alex and Ethan, Margaret made a silent promise. She would do everything in her power to ensure these boys had the best possible future, even if it meant letting them go. Love, she reflected, sometimes meant letting go. With a sigh, Margaret gently closed the bedroom door. Tomorrow would be another day, full of challenges and possibilities. But for now, on this quiet night, she allowed herself to feel hope. Hope that somehow everything would work out in the end. The sun had barely risen when Margaret's phone rang, tearing her from a restless sleep. With a racing heart, she answered, immediately recognizing Susan's distressed voice on the other end of the line. "Margaret, turn on the TV now. Channel 5. Confused but alarmed by her friend's urgent tone, Margaret jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, turning on the television with trembling fingers. The image that appeared on the screen made her stomach sink. "Intense search for missing twins," the headline announced in bold letters. Smiling photos of Alex and Ethan occupied half the screen, while a serious-faced reporter relayed the details. Brothers Alex and Ethan Evans, age 10, were reported missing last night by the foster care services. Authorities are asking anyone with information to contact them immediately. Margaret collapsed onto the sofa, her mind reeling. The fear she had been suppressing since taking the boys in now consumed her completely. She knew this moment would come, but the reality was far more terrifying than she had imagined. The phone rang again. It was Edward. "Did you see the news?" he asked without preamble. "Yes," Margaret replied, her voice trembling. "Xiaoxi, what are we going to do?" "Gather everyone at your house in an hour. We need to decide our next step." While she waited, Margaret couldn't stop thinking. The boys were still asleep in the guest room, oblivious to the chaos forming around them. She wondered if she had made the right decision by hiding them. The intention was to protect them, but now it seemed she had put them in an even more dangerous situation. An hour later, Margaret's small living room was crowded. Susan, Edward, and Claire squeezed onto the sofa and chairs, their faces tense and voices low. "We have to tell the truth," Claire said, breaking the tense silence. "Child, it's the right thing to do." Susan shook her head vehemently. "We can't. You know what will happen if the boys go back to the system. They'll be separated, maybe forever." "But what if we're caught?" Edward questioned, the fear evident in his voice. "We could be charged with kidnapping." Margaret felt the weight of the decision on her shoulders. She looked at the hallway leading to the room where Alex and Ethan slept, remembering the fear in their eyes when they arrived. "We can't abandon them now," she said firmly. "We promised to protect them." The discussion continued for hours, each weighing the pros and cons of their limited options. In the end, they reached a reluctant consensus. They would keep the boys hidden for a few more days while seeking a more permanent solution. Little did they know their decision would be tested sooner than expected. The next morning, Margaret was making coffee when she heard a knock at the door. Her heart nearly stopped when she saw 2 police officers standing on her doorstep. "Good morning, Ma'am," one of them said, his expression serious. "We're investigating the disappearance of 2 children in the area. Can we ask you a few questions?" Forcing a smile, Margaret nodded, praying her voice wouldn't tremble. "Of course. Come in." The next few minutes were a test of nerves. Margaret answered the officers' questions with studied calm, while her heart hammered in her chest. She could hear soft movements coming from the back room and prayed the boys would stay quiet. "Have you noticed any suspicious activity in the past few days? Children you don't recognize, perhaps?" one of the officers asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, nothing out of the ordinary. Just when it seemed the officers were about to leave, a noise echoed from the back of the house, the unmistakable sound of something falling." The officers' eyes narrowed. "What was that?" "Oh, it must be my cat," Margaret replied quickly, her mind racing. "He's always knocking things over." The older officer frowned. "Ma'am, we didn't see a cat when we came in." Margaret felt her blood run cold. She opened her mouth to answer, but before she could formulate an excuse, a child's voice called from the hallway, "Mrs. Thompson, we're hungry." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret closed her eyes, knowing her secret had been discovered. When she opened them again, she met the accusing gazes of the police officers. "Ma'am," one of them said, his voice stern, "I think we have a lot to talk about." The next few minutes passed in a blur. Margaret watched helplessly as the officers entered the room and found Alex and Ethan scared and confused. She tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in a mixture of pleas and justifications, but she knew it was useless. When Susan and Edward arrived, alerted by a quick phone call from Margaret, the situation was already out of control. The boys were being led outside, their small faces stained with tears, while Margaret was questioned in the living room. "Mrs. Thompson," Addie said, the detective who had arrived to lead the investigation, "I understand your intentions may have been good, but what you did is extremely serious. Harboring runaway minors is a serious crime." Margaret nodded, defeated. "I know. But if you knew what these boys have been through, the fear they have of being separated..." The detective sighed, a flicker of understanding crossing his eyes. "Look, I can't promise anything, but I'll make sure your side of the story is heard. For now, we'll have to take the boys to a temporary shelter." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Margaret was taken to the police station to give her statement, while Susan and Edward worked furiously behind the scenes, contacting everyone they knew in the legal system to try and mitigate the situation. When night finally fell, Margaret found herself sitting in her empty kitchen, an untouched cup of tea cooling in front of her. The silence of the house was deafening, a painful reminder of the laughter and conversations that had filled it in recent months. Susan entered quietly, sitting beside Margaret. "We got a hearing for tomorrow," she said softly. "Edward thinks we can argue that you were acting in the children's best interests." Margaret nodded, too exhausted to reply. Her thoughts were with Alex and Ethan, imagining how they must be feeling alone in a strange place again. "We'll get them back," Susan promised, squeezing Margaret's hand. "One way or another, we'll make this right." Margaret looked at her friend, a spark of determination igniting in her tired eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We will. These boys deserve a home, and we'll do whatever it takes to make sure they have one." As the night wore on, Margaret and her friends prepared for the battle ahead. The road would be difficult, but they were determined to fight. For Alex, for Ethan, and for the future these boys deserved. Edward's office was immersed in a tense silence when Susan entered, carrying a thick folder. Margaret was already there, sitting in a leather armchair, her fingers drumming nervously on the armrest. Edward, in turn, was standing by the window, his gaze lost in the cityscape of Willow Creek. "I found her," Susan announced, her voice breaking the silence. Both Margaret and Edward turned to her, expectation evident on their faces. Susan opened the folder on Edward's desk. "Claire Evans. She lives just 3 blocks from here." Margaret stood up, her legs trembling slightly. So close, all this time. Edward adjusted his glasses, examining the documents. "How could we not have found her before?" Susan sighed, leafing through some papers. "That's where things get complicated. It seems there was a massive bureaucratic error. When the twins' parents died, Claire filed for custody. But due to a typo in her last name, the request was filed incorrectly." "A typo?" Margaret exclaimed, incredulous. "This whole situation because of a simple mistake." Edward shook his head, his expression grave. "Unfortunately, it's more common than we'd like to admit. Bureaucratic systems are notoriously prone to human error." "And the boys?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly. "How did they end up in the foster care system if they had an aunt willing to take care of them?" Susan flipped through some more documents. Apparently, since Claire's request wasn't found and no other relatives were located immediately, the twins were placed in temporary foster care. And then, well, we know the rest. A heavy silence fell over the room as they all absorbed the magnitude of the situation. Years of separation, suffering and uncertainty, all because of an administrative error. Margaret was the first to break the silence. "We need to tell her. Claire deserves to know that her nephews are alive and so close." Edward frowned. "And it's not that simple, Margaret. Legally, we're still in a delicate position. We hid the boys. Even if with good intentions, we could face serious charges. But we can't just keep this information to ourselves," Margaret protested, her voice rising with emotion. "Think of Claire, everything she must have gone through all these years believing she had lost her family forever." Susan placed a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. "We understand how you feel, Margaret, but Edward is right. We need to be cautious about how we proceed." Margaret sank back into the armchair, feeling the weight of the situation. So, what do we do?" Edward began pacing the room, his mind clearly working on possible solutions. "We need to find a way to reunite Claire with the twins without incriminating ourselves in the process. What if..." Susan began hesitantly. "What if we create a situation where Claire could find the boys by chance?" Margaret and Edward looked at her, intrigued. Susan continued, her idea taking shape as she spoke. "We could arrange for the boys to be in a public place, perhaps the park near Claire's house. Then, somehow, we'd ensure Claire was there at the same time." "An accidental meeting," Edward murmured, considering the idea. "That could work. Legally, we could argue that we had no direct involvement in the reunion." Margaret, however, seemed hesitant. "But what about the boys? How would we explain it to them? What if they get scared when they see a stranger approaching?" "We'll have to prepare them," Susan said softly. "We can't tell them the whole truth, but we can explain that we found someone who might be their family, and that we want them to meet her." The group spent the next few hours working out the details of the plan. They decided the meeting would take place the following Sunday at Willow Creek Central Park. Edward would use his contacts to ensure Claire was there, while Margaret would take the twins for a special day at the park. The night before the big day, Margaret sat with Alex and Ethan, their hearts heavy with the secret they carried. "Boys," she began softly, "tomorrow we're going to have a special day at the park." The twins smiled, excited, but something in Margaret's expression made them hesitate. "There's something more, isn't there?" Alex asked, always perceptive. Margaret nodded, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, dear. We discovered that you might have some family, an aunt you've never met. She'll be at the park tomorrow." The boys' eyes widened at the news. Ethan was the first to speak, his voice trembling slightly. "An aunt? But what about you, Mrs. Thompson?" Margaret's heart clenched at the worry evident in the boy's voice. "Oh, my dears, no matter what happens, I will always be a part of your lives, always." That night, as the twins finally fell asleep, Margaret stayed awake, her mind filled with worries and hopes. She knew that the next day could change everything, for better or for worse. When the sun rose the next morning, Margaret, Alex, and Ethan headed to the park, the air thick with anticipation. Edward and Susan were already there, mingling with the Sunday crowd, observing discreetly. It was then that Margaret saw her, a middle-aged woman with brown hair and eyes that strongly resembled the twins. Claire Evans had arrived. The moment of truth had come. Margaret held the boys at hands, her heart pounding. "Remember," she whispered, "no matter what happens, I'm here for you." As they approached the spot where Claire sat, Margaret offered a silent prayer, hoping this would be the beginning of a new and happy chapter in the lives of the boys who had stolen her heart. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Margaret's yard as she, Susan, and Edward finalized the details of their plan to reunite the twins with their Aunt Claire. The tension in the air was palpable, mixed with cautious hope. "So it's settled," Edward said, closing his briefcase. "Tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Central Park." Susan nodded, her face a mixture of determination and worry. "Let's hope everything goes smoothly." Margaret was about to reply when the doorbell rang, echoing through the house. The three exchanged puzzled glances. They weren't expecting anyone else. "I'll get it," Margaret said, getting up. As she opened the door, her heart nearly stopped. There, standing on her doorstep, was a face she hadn't seen in 3 decades. Older, with wrinkles around his eyes and graying hair, but unmistakable. "Richard," she whispered, incredulous. The man smiled hesitantly, his blue eyes, the same ones she had once loved, filled with a mixture of regret and hope. "Hello, Margaret. It's been a long time." Margaret felt her legs weaken. 30 years of repressed emotions, anger, pain, confusion, threatened to overflow. "What are you doing here?" she managed to say, her voice trembling. Richard ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture Margaret remembered well. I saw you yesterday at the market, with 2 boys." Margaret's blood ran cold. Alex and Ethan. She had taken them to buy ingredients for a cake, an attempt to distract them from the anxiety about the planned meeting with Claire. "And?" Margaret asked, her voice now hard. "Can I come in? Please. We need to talk." For a moment, Margaret considered slamming the door in his face. But something, curiosity perhaps, or the echo of long-buried feelings, made her step aside. Richard entered, and Margaret led him to the living room, where Susan and Edward watched the scene with astonishment. "This is Richard," Margaret said simply. "My ex-husband." The silence that followed was heavy enough to be cut with a knife. It was Edward who broke it first. "Mr. Richard," he said, his voice cautiously neutral, "what brings you here after so many years?" Richard looked at Margaret, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I came to make amends, to offer help, if I can." Margaret felt a wave of anger surge. "Help? After 30 years? After abandoning me when I needed you most?" The pain in her voice was palpable, making Richard visibly flinch. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Margaret. What I did is unforgivable. But when I saw you with those boys, something awakened in me, a chance to do something right, perhaps." Susan, ever the mediator, intervened. "What kind of help are you offering exactly?" Richard hesitated for a moment before answering. I have contacts, people in positions who can help with delicate situations." Edward's eyes narrowed. "What kind of contacts?" "The kind that can make things happen without too many questions," Richard replied, his tone meaningful. A tense silence fell over the room as everyone processed the implications of this offer. Margaret felt her world spinning. Richard's unexpected arrival, his offer of help, it all further complicated an already delicate situation. It was at that moment that the back door opened and the cheerful voices of Alex and Ethan filled the house. They had been playing in the yard and now entered, faces flushed and smiles bright. "Mrs. Thompson, who is this gentleman?" Alex asked, his curiosity evident. Margaret felt her heart clench. How to explain this complicated situation to 2 children who had already been through so much? "This is Richard," she said softly. An old friend." The twins' eyes lit up with interest. "Is he going to help us find our aunt?" Ethan asked innocently. Richard looked at Margaret in surprise, who nodded slightly. "Maybe," she replied to Ethan. "We're still talking about it." The boys, sensing the tension in the air, exchanged glances before Ethan spoke again. "Can we stay and listen?" "Please." Margaret hesitated, looking at Susan and Edward for guidance. After a moment of silent consideration, she nodded. "All right, but remember, some of the things we discuss here are complicated." As everyone settled in, Margaret felt the weight of the decisions they would have to make. Richard's presence added a new layer of complexity to an already risky plan. Could they trust him? Were his intentions truly pure, or was there something more behind his sudden offer of help? Looking at the anxious faces of Alex and Ethan, Margaret knew that whatever they decided now would affect not only the boys' future, but her own as well. The past she thought she had left behind had returned, bringing with it a storm of emotions and possibilities. As the conversation unfolded, detailing the risks and potential benefits of Richard's help, Margaret felt torn. Part of her wanted to reject anything coming from the man who had hurt her so deeply. Another part, however, couldn't ignore the possibility that his help could be crucial to securing a safe future for Alex and Ethan. The twins watched the discussion with attentive eyes, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated a surprising understanding of the situation. Their presence served as a constant reminder of what was truly at stake. As night began to fall, casting long shadows across the room, a decision needed to be made. The meeting with Claire was scheduled for the following day, and Richard's unexpected arrival had thrown a wrench into their carefully crafted plans. Margaret looked at each face in the room: Susan, her loyal friend; Edward, the pragmatic advisor; Alex and Ethan, the children who had stolen her heart; and Richard, a ghost from her past offering a chance at redemption. With a deep sigh, she prepared to make a decision that would change the course of all their lives. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back now. The morning sun filtered through the curtains of Margaret's living room, casting dancing shadows on the carpet. The tension in the air was palpable as Margaret, Richard, Claire, and the twins gathered for what promised to be a decisive conversation. Margaret sat stiffly on the sofa, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Richard occupied an armchair to her right, his face a mask of forced calm. Claire stood leaning against the opposite wall, her watchful eyes alternating between Margaret and Richard. Alex and Ethan sat on the floor near Margaret, their gazes curious and apprehensive. "Why now, Richard?" Margaret finally broke the silence, her voice trembling slightly. "After all these years, why did you decide to show up just when the boys came into our lives?" Richard took a deep breath before answering. "I know it seems convenient, Margaret, but the truth is, I've gone through a transformation in the last few years. I realized how much I lost, how much I wasted." Claire scoffed, crossing her arms. "Just a convenient transformation, isn't it? Just when there are vulnerable children involved." "Claire," Margaret murmured, giving her friend a warning look. Although she appreciated the support, she needed to hear Richard out without interference. "I understand your distrust, Claire," Richard said, turning to face her, "but I assure you, my intentions are genuine." "I'm not here for any ulterior motive." Margaret leaned forward, her piercing eyes fixed on Richard. "Then tell me, Richard, what changed? Why now?" Richard ran a hand through his graying hair, a gesture Margaret recognized from their younger days. "3 years ago, I had a heart attack," he began. "It was a wake-up call, a moment of clarity. I realized I had wasted decades chasing things that didn't really matter. Money, status, power, none of it meant anything when I thought I might die without having made peace with my past, without having tried to fix the mistakes I made." Margaret felt a lump forming in her throat. "And why didn't you look for us before?" "Fear," Richard admitted, his voice low. "Fear of being rejected, of it being too late. I spent the last few years working on myself, trying to become someone worthy of being a part of your lives again." Claire stepped forward, her eyes still suspicious. "And how can we be sure this isn't just an elaborate act?" Richard turned to her, his face serious. "I can't prove my intentions with words. I can only ask for a chance to demonstrate them with actions." At that moment, Alex stood up, his small hand seeking Margaret's. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice surprisingly firm, "we want you to know that no matter what happens, we want you in our lives." Ryan nodded vigorously, joining his brother. You'll always be our family, no matter what other people decide to do or be. Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. My dears, she murmured, pulling them into a tight hug. Richard watched the scene with a mixture of emotions on his face. You two are amazing, he said softly. So Margaret has done a wonderful job taking care of you. Yes, she has, Ethan replied, his voice firm. And that's why her opinion is the one that matters most to us right now. All eyes turned to Margaret. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. Richard, she began, her voice calm but firm, you hurt us deeply in the past. Your absence left scars that took years to heal. I can't deny that part of me still distrusts your intentions. Richard lowered his head, accepting her words. However, Margaret continued, I also can't deny that people can change. And if there's a chance, however small, that you truly want to be a part of this family in a positive way, I don't have the right to prevent that. Claire stepped forward, concern evident on her face. Margaret, are you sure? Margaret nodded slowly. It won't be easy, Richard. You'll have to prove day after day that your intentions are true. And at the first sign that this might harm the boys or any of us, I won't hesitate to cut all ties. Richard stood up, his face a mixture of relief and determination. I understand completely. I promise I'll do everything in my power to deserve this chance. Well, Alex said, breaking the tense silence that followed. I guess that means we have a lot to talk about and get to know. Ethan agreed. Maybe we can start with lunch, all of us together. Margaret looked at Claire, who still seemed skeptical, but nodded reluctantly. I suppose I can endure a meal, she murmured. As they made plans for lunch, Margaret observed the scene before her. Richard, trying to awkwardly fit into the conversation, the twins, curious but cautious, Claire, vigilant as ever, and herself, at the center of it all, navigating unfamiliar waters. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. There would be moments of doubt, of resurfacing anger, of old wounds reopening. But looking at Alex and Ethan, seeing the cautious hope in their eyes, Margaret knew she had made the right choice. As the conversation flowed around her, Margaret allowed herself a moment of reflection. Months ago, she had made a decision that changed the course of her life by taking in 2 lost boys on Christmas Eve. Now she was making another equally important choice. But this time she wasn't alone. She had the love of Alex and Ethan, Claire's support, and perhaps, just perhaps, the chance to heal old wounds with Richard. The future was uncertain, but Margaret was ready to face it. With a soft sigh, she rejoined the conversation, taking the first step toward a new chapter in their lives. A chapter that promised challenges, but also the possibility of a rebuilt family, stronger and more united than ever. Willow Creek's Central Park was bathed in the golden light of early morning when Margaret arrived with Alex and Ethan. The boys, dressed in their best clothes, were visibly nervous, their small hands gripping Margaret's tightly. And it's all right, dears, Margaret reassured them, though her own heart was racing. Remember, no matter what happens, I'll always be here for you. They sat on a bench near the gazebo, the agreed-upon meeting place. Minutes passed, feeling like hours, until Margaret spotted a familiar figure approaching. Claire. When their eyes met, time seemed to freeze. Claire stopped, her eyes widening at the sight of the boys. Alex and Ethan, in turn, looked from Margaret to Claire, understanding slowly dawning on their faces. Aunt Claire, Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. With tears in her eyes, Claire rushed towards them. In seconds, she was kneeling before the bench, her hands trembling as she touched the twins' mild faces. My boys, she sobbed, pulling them into a tight embrace. My sweet boys. Alex and Ethan, initially hesitant, soon surrendered to the hug, their own tears starting to fall. Margaret watched the scene, her heart breaking and swelling at the same time. After a few moments, Claire pulled away, looking at Margaret with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Margaret took a deep breath. It was time for the truth. Claire, there's a lot I need to tell you. In the following minutes, Margaret revealed everything. How she found the boys, the investigations, the discoveries about the bureaucratic error. Claire listened intently, her emotions fluctuating between shock, anger, and finally understanding. "I should be furious with you for hiding this from me," Claire said finally. "But you protected them when I couldn't. Thank you." At that moment, Edward appeared, his face grave. "Margaret, the authorities are on their way. Someone must have seen us and reported it." Panic began to set in, but before they could react, a familiar voice sounded behind them. "I'll leave this to me." It was Richard. He approached quickly, cell phone in hand. "I have contacts in the police department. I can buy some time to explain the situation properly." Margaret looked at him, surprised. "Richard, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," he interrupted gently. "It's the least I can do to start making amends." While Richard made calls, something incredible began to happen. People from the neighborhood who had witnessed the emotional scene started to approach. Neighbors, local shopkeepers, all offering support. "Margaret has always cared for these children as if they were her own," said Mrs. Thompson, owner of the local bakery. "These boys have never been as happy as they have been in the past few months with her," added Mr. Peterson, the retired music teacher. One after another, people came forward, willing to testify to Margaret's character and the twins' well-being under her care. When the authorities finally arrived, they found not a kidnapping situation, but a united community, ready to defend one of their own. In the weeks that followed, hearings were held, testimonies were given, and the full truth came to light. The bureaucratic error was acknowledged, and the flaws in the foster care system were exposed, leading to a broader investigation. Richard Dewes, keeping his promise, used his contacts and resources to assist in the legal process. His intervention was crucial in preventing more serious charges against Margaret and in expediting the custody process. Finally, the day arrived for the final decision on the twins' custody. The courtroom was packed, with almost all of Willow Creek present to support Margaret and the boys. When the judge announced his decision, a tense silence fell over the room. "Considering all the extraordinary circumstances of this case," the judge began, "the court grants legal custody of Alex and Ethan Evans to their aunt, Claire Evans." There was a moment of collective disappointment, but the judge wasn't finished. However, recognizing the significant bond formed between the boys and Mrs. Margaret Thompson, the court also grants her extensive visitation rights and an active role in the boys' lives. The room erupted in applause. Alex and Ethan ran to hug Margaret, tears of joy streaming down their faces. "Did you hear that, Mrs. Thompson?" Alex exclaimed. "Now you'll still be a part of our lives." Margaret hugged them tightly, her heart overflowing with emotion. "Always, my dears, always." Claire approached, a genuine smile on her face. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything. I hope we can raise these boys together as a family." Richard, who had been watching from a distance, hesitantly approached. I'd like to be a part of this too, if you'll allow me, perhaps as an uncle or a family friend." Margaret looked at Claire and the boys, who nodded in agreement. "I think we can try," she replied, a small smile forming on her lips. As the crowd celebrated around them, Margaret looked at the diverse group that now formed her family: Claire, the twins, Richard, Susan, Edward, and all the members of the community who had come together to support them. At that moment, surrounded by love, support, and a sense of new beginnings, Margaret knew that no matter what the future held, they would face it together, as a family, an unconventional family perhaps, but a family united by love, compassion, and the courage to give second chances. The aroma of roast turkey and apple pie filled Claire's house, mingling with the sound of laughter and animated conversation. It was Christmas Eve, 6 months after the tumultuous summer that changed all their lives. Margaret was in the kitchen, helping Claire with the final preparations for dinner. The two women worked in harmony, as if they had been kitchen partners for a lifetime. "Who would have thought we'd be here like this, after everything?" Claire commented, smiling as she sprinkled cinnamon on the pie. Margaret chuckled softly. "Life has an interesting way of surprising us, doesn't it?" In the living room, Alex and Ethan were engaged in a fierce chess match with Richard. The older man had proven to be a patient mentor, teaching the boys not only game strategies, but also valuable lessons about patience and perseverance. "Checkmate," Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up with a triumphant smile. Richard feigned dramatic despair, making the boys laugh. "Oh, you two are getting too good for this, old man." Margaret watched the scene from the kitchen doorway, her heart filling with an emotion she could barely name. It was a mixture of joy, gratitude, and a tinge of melancholy for lost time. The sound of the doorbell announced the arrival of guests. Soon, the house was filled with familiar faces, Susan and Edward, neighbors and friends from the community who had rallied to support them during difficult times. As everyone gathered around the dinner table, Margaret couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them there. Looking at the faces around her, she saw not just a family, but a complex tapestry of relationships, all interwoven by choices, forgiveness, and love. Claire, radiant in her role as a mother, served the dishes with affection. The twins, happier and more secure than Margaret had ever seen them, alternated between telling animated stories and devouring the food with youthful enthusiasm. Richard, sitting next to Margaret, occasionally glanced in her direction, glances filled with regret for the past made, but also with hope for the future. His presence, once a source of conflict, now brought unexpected comfort. After dinner, as everyone gathered around the Christmas tree to exchange gifts, Margaret asked for everyone's attention. "Before we begin," she said, her voice choked with emotion, "I'd like to say a few words." The group fell silent, all eyes on her. "A year ago, I was alone, convinced that my days of family and love were in the past, but fate had other plans." She smiled at Alex and Ethan. "Two little angels came into my life and turned everything upside down." Margaret paused, looking at each face in the room. "This journey has taught us that love can blossom in the most unlikely of circumstances, that families can be formed not just by blood, but by choice and commitment." She raised her glass. "So, this Christmas, I want to propose a toast. To the second chance we've been given, to the love that has united us, and to the family we've created, complex, imperfect, but infinitely precious." "To family," everyone echoed, glasses clinking in celebration. As the evening progressed, filled with the exchange of gifts, games, and more laughter, Margaret found herself momentarily alone, observing the scene before her. Alex and Ethan, nestled in Claire's arms, listening to a Christmas story. Richard, engaged in an animated conversation with Edward's Susan, handing out another round of hot chocolate. In that moment, Margaret felt a profound peace. The path that had brought them there hadn't been easy, but every challenge, every tear shed, had been worth it for this moment of pure joy and connection. As the first snowflakes began to fall outside, Margaret smiled, her heart overflowing with gratitude. This wasn't just a new chapter in their lives. It was the beginning of an entirely new story, full of promise and infinite possibilities. And with that comforting thought, she rejoined her family, ready to embrace whatever adventures the future might bring.